Then we can go into probably the most important, I tell my SEs, the most important concepts for a true security policy administrator to understand is learning, staging, and enforcement. And many, what I've gathered, many don't understand them, which is why they end up with some problems and some attacks still occurring on their website, even though they have ASM in place. So we're going to cover several things in this lesson. We'll do this, and then we'll have exercise, and then we'll be able to do lunch. Should be about the timing for that. First thing to understand about policy, security policies, is this concept called entities. ASM, there are 4 different entity types, which you've already had little experience with. The first is your file types. That is known as an entity. We also have URLs, also known as an entity, and then the parameters. Password, these parameter names, username, password. Those are entities. And we have a 4th entity. Anybody know what it is?
Cookies.
Cookies, very good. Cookies is also an entity as well. The reason why this is important to understand is because these are things that I can create whitelists of. I can have a loud whitelist of all of these, which is what builds my positive security model. That's what leads us into this next discussion. But let's talk a little bit more about parameters, just to make sure everybody understands what a parameter is. Parameters is how we as users interact with web pages. We're able to put in information, select lists here, put in checkboxes and radio buttons, and click on buttons. All of these are called parameters, and they're used for us to interact with this website. And again, every single one of these parameters has a name attached that we'll have to know, which we can do by inspecting and looking at the form in some sort of inspection tool. This is the Chrome inspection tools. You guys will use the Chrome inspection tools today, but you'll use it a lot tomorrow when we're playing with WebSync and doing stuff inside the inspection tools. You also sometimes see URLs, you also sometimes see parameters in the URI. The indicator is this right here, that question mark. When you see a question mark in the URL, that means that directly following that question mark is going to be some parameter names, then equal sign, and then the value by the user. Then you'll see an ampersand. That means, there's another parameter name after that. Equal sign, there's the value submitted by the user. I created this URL by going to a website called Fandango, which is how you get movie times, and I put in my zip code and I clicked on go. And that was what was submitted back to the web server. So that's a little bit more about parameters. So to build a policy takes 3 simple steps. 3 steps and you're done. Bing, bang, boom, all done. 3 steps. You start with learning, then staging, and then enforcement. All 3, you're ready to go. Now, I wish it was that simple. It's not. There's processes involved to go through learning, staging, and enforcement, but you do need to go through all of these stages before you're going to have a security policy that is truly ready to protect. So we're going to cover each one of these, learning, staging, and enforcement. We'll start with learning. You just did learning in your last exercise. Everything you just did was all about learning. You learned about all the file types that were needed. In fact, in your last exercise, the last part of your exercise, you just submitted some requests and you went and looked at this page, and oh, look, you already had all the list of file types. You learned the list of file types. You learned the list of URLs. So those were all of my, that was my allowed URLs. This is my URL whitelist. And then you also saw your parameters. You learned all the parameters that were needed. Likewise, this is the parameter whitelist. Everything on this screen right now, these are all considered entities in this security policy. So learning applies to entities. I want to learn all of the entities needed for my security policy. I think that's what you already just did in your last exercise. How do I do this? Well, you just did this in your last exercise as well. You go to your learning and blocking settings page. Again, this is the page where you do all the magic. You went down to these sections for file types, URLs, parameters, cookies. For each one, you could have, you don't have to do it for all of them. You don't have to do it for any of them. But if you want, you could choose to learn all new file types. You could choose to learn all new URLs, parameters, and cookies. Fundamental and comprehensive already include these to some degree. Not the same. Comprehensive includes more than fundamental. And again, fundamental includes more than rapid deployment. So that's what you did in your last exercise. You configured learning, you submitted requests, you got your whitelist, you're done. But now staging. This is probably, this for me as an 8-year F5 employee, this was the part that took me the longest to understand about ASM. And part of it is because it was taught to me incorrectly. And so as it was taught to me incorrectly, and then I was trying to put it in context with teaching, it never made sense. And I don't even remember how I got over the hurdle, to be honest. It's been so long now. But I think this is the area that's the most fuzzy for most people to try to understand. I want you to understand it, and it's important for you to make sure that your students understand it. If they can understand what's going on in the next few slides, then you and they are going to be in much better position as an ASM policy building administrator. So the first thing to understand is staging applies to attributes of an entity. So let's say I had my list of a student list for all of you Monday morning who could come into class. And as you came to the door, I looked on my list. I wanted to make sure you were on the list. That's my list. That's my whitelist. And if you're on the list, you can come in. If you're not on the list, you can't come in. Simple as that. But what if I added to it? What if I said, it's more than just being on the list. I also want to verify that you did all your pre-work. So I'm going to check that. I also want to verify that you're dressed appropriately, business casual. No flip-flops. I also want to verify that you look like a nice person. You're not going to be grumpy for 4 days. So I have to look at these different attributes about you. So maybe you finish your pre-work, you look like a nice person. I'm sorry, you're wearing flip-flops. You can't come into class. So even though you're on my whitelist, still not enough. Attributes about something. So we'll start by talking about file type attributes. There are only 4 of these attributes that apply to file types, and they're all length attributes. For example, I'm going to look at my ASP file type, and we have an attribute for the URL length. That's the URL right there. This was a request that was submitted by a user. This URL is only 31 bytes, far below the maximum that is currently set. So this would be considered a legal request. Somebody else submits this URL request, which is 116 bytes. This violates the length attribute, and therefore this would be considered illegal and may or may not be blocked. which depends on something we'll talk about in a few more slides. But the key is this would be considered illegal. We also have another attribute, another linked attribute. It's the entire HTTP request. The request line, all the headers, any post data. Right now, this HTTP request, that's a 719 byte request, well below 5,000 bytes. Imagine if somebody is using a tool like Burp Suite to create HTTP requests that have 1 million characters in them, and they're sending them to the web server. And the web server is trying to process these 1 million character HTTP requests. We don't want that. So this is good. We have a nice limit to prevent that. The query string. The query string is the URL along with any parameter names and values. So there's the question mark, there's the parameter names and the values. That is set by default typically to about 1,000 character maximum. That's only 71 bytes. No problem, that's legal. This query string, they intentionally made the value of one of these parameters very, very, very long, extremely long, so that the total length of this query string is now 1,186 bytes. That violates this. That means this is going to be considered illegal, and it may or may not be blocked, depending on something we'll talk about in a few more slides. Then the last link is the post data link. That's when you're submitting form values. So I'm putting in a new user account for Facebook. Here's my first name, my last name, my address, so. Click on submit. And that gets sent in this kind of a format. The default post data length is 1,000. Right now, this post data length is too long. That would be considered illegal, may or may not be blocked. These values, of course, can be changed and probably will be changed based on staging. So these are 4 different attributes of this entity. And each entity, meaning each file type, can have its own unique attributes. So notice all of my file types have some of them have different length values. That's totally possible and possibly likely. This is what that might look like in the configuration utility. On my allowed file types page, here are all the attributes. And you'll notice for each file type, they may or may not have different links. Now what I've found is understanding this attribute concept it's a little confusing when you're talking about file types. So I usually find it's a little bit easier to explain when we're talking about parameters, because the attributes around parameters are usually a little bit more identifiable. We recognize them a little bit easier. So here's an example. For parameters, I'm going to go ahead and look at the LName parameter. What do you suppose that is? Last name, probably, we would assume. So one of the attributes of a parameter is the data type. This parameter, data type, was set to alphanumeric. That means numbers and letters only. This person submitted that last name. It contains more than numbers or letters, has the hyphen. So that would actually be considered an illegal request and may or may not get blocked. Another attribute is the maximum length submitted by the user. Right now, the last name is set to 25 maximum length characters. This, I actually looked this up on Google. This actually is the longest known last name out there right now. No joke. Clearly longer than 25 characters, and that would be considered an illegal request. May or may not get blocked. Another attribute is literally every keyboard character. If you look at your keyboard, you got all these keyboard keys, letters, numbers, special characters. Every single one of those keyboard characters can be defined as an allowed character or not allowed character for a parameter. So for this particular parameter, we have said only A through Z. That doesn't count. Neither does that space. Those are both going to violate this particular parameter, and that may or may not get blocked. This last name submission, it matches all of the attribute criteria. This would be considered a legal request. And just like our file types, every single parameter can have its own attributes. And likely, every single parameter will have its own attributes. For example, my last name maximum length is set to 25, but the comment where they can freely type in their thoughts and feelings, whatever, like a Facebook post, it's going to have a much longer maximum length. The allowed characters for my comments, there's a lot more allowed characters because I want them to be able to type sentences with commas and spaces and periods and question marks and you name it. Notice we have other data types, like a phone data type and an integer data type. So this, again, helps us define exactly the kind of data that people can submit for my web application. Now, if you think back to my analogy from 3-Day Partner Bootcamp about the home security, sometimes people might look at this and go, wow, that seems, that's great, you can do that, but that seems like a lot of stuff to set up. And it is. Because you're not going to do all this if your security policy doesn't need this much security. If this is my intranet website, I don't need that much security. I'll set it over here like my home, like the front door alarm. But if this is my online banking, where people are doing banking transfers, balance transfers, and deposits, I need as much security as possible. So the fact that we can get to this level of security is great. It's fantastic. It sets us apart. So that's the concept of attributes of entities. Now the question is this: how do those attributes, how are they figured out? How do we figure out that the comment last name should be 500 characters long? I'm sorry, the comment field should be 500 characters long. How do we figure out that the comment should have all those meta characters? That's done during the staging process. So here is how the staging process works. We start back at the learning process. We've got these suggestions, and the suggestions have the learning scores, and the learning scores are going up slowly over time. We talked about this earlier, nothing different. After a few weeks, a couple of those learning scores have hit 100%. What happens now when it's at 100%?
Well, it depends on what your learning mode is.
It depends. Very good. It depends. If I'm in manual mode, I have to manually add those to my policy. If I'm in automatic mode, they will automatically get added to my policy. They are now on my parameter list. They're in my parameter whitelist. And that begins the staging process. That's when the staging process begins for those two parameters. If I immediately go look at these two parameters in my parameter list page, if I look at the properties of them, this is what I will see of their current attributes. The only attribute will be parameter type equals ignore value. What that means is right now, ASM knows this parameter is valid, but that's all it cares about. It's not going to block any requests of any type of data going into the parameter, not presently. All it's going to do is start looking at all these requests from all these users over time, all these unique sessions that are submitting comments, adding their last name, they're submitting all these requests, and it's just looking at every request, and slowly over time, maybe a week later, I'll go back and I'll look at the two parameters again. And I might say, oh look, it's changed a little bit. The comment parameter is now user input value. The data type's been changed to alphanumeric, and the maximum length was set to 50. Last name is similar, except the maximum length was set to 10. That's a problem though, big problem. That's not long enough for my comment, but that's okay. ASM is still evaluating. It's still evaluating. This is not a final answer. So we'll let more time go by. Another few weeks. We go back and look again. Oh, it's changed again. It's now changed the maximum length up to 300. It's also now identified some allowed characters. Everything from A to Z, 0 to 9, the carriage return, the space, some of these other keyboard characters. Notice the last thing has only added A through Z and 0 through 9 for the allowed characters. Has a different maximum length. And they're all checking for attack signatures. This is what it looks like in the on the actual configuration utility. So here is these three attributes: input value, alphanumeric, maximum length. Then we can look at the allowed meta characters. Here's all the allowed meta characters that have been defined as allowed for this parameter. And then we have another tab there, the attack signatures. Not all of the thousands of attack signatures for a policy are parameter signatures. Only the ones defined as parameter signatures. And in this case, there's only about 600 of them. But these are going to be signatures to identify SQL injection, cross-site scripting, command execution, many other common attacks. That's going to be in this list here. So we're building what I call a picture, a snapshot of each parameter. I want to see what each parameter is looking like based on the data people are submitting, what people are submitting into those form fields. So each parameter is getting a little picture, like on my phone. And ASM continues to build that picture. And what we're looking for is to see, does the picture change? So for example, if this is my comment field, and it said 300 maximum length, and then nothing changed in terms of user requests around the world. But all of a sudden, actually let me use a different example. Let's say, because this is the example I used last week, it's easier to explain. Let's say it said question mark is fine, period is fine, semicolon is fine. It added those meta characters. No exclamation point. No exclamation point yet. And then they just released the new Madonna album. So we just put that out on the market to sell. And all of a sudden, all these people around the world are adding comments, love this new album, exclamation point. You've got to buy this album, exclamation point. So all of a sudden there's all these new requests that are coming in that include that new character that was not on the list. What that means is the picture has now changed just a little bit. ASM's picture of that parameter has changed. And what we're going to see on this page is the enforcement process. The enforcement process. So what this is telling me, these little indicators here, it's saying learning suggestions available. That's another way of saying that is the picture has changed. Something's changed from what I saw yesterday to today. I think you should, ASM is going to say, I think you should also include the exclamation point. A lot of new long requests have come in. I think maybe we should change the maximum length to 500. The picture has changed for that particular parameter. And the picture has changed for this parameter. So that's what that indicator means for us. So how long does this take place? How long does this process take place? In the older version of ASM, back I think around version 11, when you created a security policy, it was more like a wizard. There was like 5 steps you had to move through. And on one of the steps, you actually saw this field. Well, they took that field off of the policy creation page for whatever reason, I don't know. You can still see this on your policy properties. It's called the enforcement readiness period. And by default, it's always set at 7 days. All right. So what does that actually mean? What it means is, let's again go back to my comment parameter. Just one parameter. So ASM's continuing to look at requests that come in. And it's created this picture. And now time's going by. And 3 days later, a lot of people are submitting requests with parentheses. Enough requests. It doesn't just take one. It's just like learning. It doesn't just take one person's request. It takes several requests from several sources. It also takes into account trusted requests much faster than untrusted requests. But if enough information comes in from people with parentheses, then ASM says, hey, I think the picture's different. I think we need to add parentheses. And then it resets that timing. We're back to day 0 again. And now we say, let's add parentheses. Now we're back to day 0. Now another day goes by. Another day goes by. 3 days, 4 days, 5 days. Suddenly a lot of people are submitting really, really long requests. Enough people are submitting long requests that ASM says, you know what, I don't think 500 is long enough. I think maybe we want to go to 1,000 maximum length. So it makes a new suggestion, and it resets this timing again, and maybe changes that from 500 to 1,000. Now we start again. 1, 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, 5, 6 days. We hit 7 days. And the picture we have of that parameter has not changed in 7 days. The maximum length, no suggestions to make it higher, no more new meta characters suggested, and so forth. At that point, we will now see this indicator on the parameter list page. It says, hey, I think that parameter is now ready to be enforced. I think we have the complete picture of exactly what that parameter should look like and how I want to protect it. Now at that point, we can enforce it or not. It's really up to us. But whether it immediately gets enforced or not depends upon whether or not we're in manual mode or automatic mode. If we're in manual mode, it could just stay like this forever. Always ready to be enforced and never enforced. Problem? Who knows? Let's talk about it in a few more slides. But if you're in automatic mode, the moment it says it's ready to be enforced, it will immediately enforce it. And so now these parameters are no longer in staging, which means they are now enforced, which means any of the attributes we determined, these characters, the maximum length, any of those attributes will now be honored by new requests, and they will be considered illegal if they violate them. This is incredibly important because we need to understand exactly when a request is going to be allowed by ASM and when a request is going to be blocked. So all of this that I've talked about in the last 20 minutes, it all is about which requests get allowed and which get blocked. So let's review that now. We're going to start as a little bit of review, just with our file type and parameter whitelists. So there's all of the allowed file types for my policy and all of the allowed parameters for my policy. And somebody has just submitted this request. That's not in my whitelist. Somebody else has just submitted this request. That parameter is not in my whitelist. So these are both illegal requests. When I'm in transparent mode, will these two requests be allowed or blocked?
Allowed.
They're going to be allowed because nothing gets blocked in transparent mode. Always remember that. How about if I'm in blocking mode? Will those two illegal requests be allowed or blocked?
It's still allowed until they're added to the policy.
They are added to the policy. Well, what do you mean they are added to the policy? Hmm? Right now, if they were in blocking mode, are these going to be allowed or blocked? Say it again? I'm getting some allowed, some blocked.
It's blocked.
This was done in exercise 2 of the 3-day partner bootcamp. In the 3-day partner bootcamp, they create a whitelist of file types, they move to blocking mode, then they try to access .ini.
It's blocked.
It's blocked. Correct. Any requests that violate the whitelists in blocking mode get blocked. This is what happened in exercise 2 of the 3-day partner bootcamp. That's why this is essentially review. But now we'll talk about attributes of an entity. And we're going to use the comment entity, the comment parameter. Notice right now, these parameters are all still in staging, non-enforced. And these are all of the current attributes of my comment parameter. User input value, alphanumeric, 300 maximum characters. There's my list of allowed meta characters, and it's blocking on all parameter attack signatures. And somebody has submitted this request in the comment field. So this is a very good example of a non-malicious request that is actually illegal. It's illegal because this exclamation mark is not on the allowed character list at this time. So this is considered an illegal request. Here's another submission for the comment. Some of you probably recognize that. That's a cross-site scripting attempt. So that's going to trigger a signature violation on my parameter. So these two illegal requests, while we're in transparent mode, will they be allowed or blocked?
Allowed.
Allowed. Nothing gets blocked in transparent mode. What about when we move to blocking mode? Will these two requests be allowed or blocked? They're going to be allowed. This is the key thing to remember from this slide. I'll go back to it in a few more minutes. They're allowed because
Yes.
they're not enforced. The parameters aren't enforced. But finally, one or all of my parameters have been enforced. They're out of staging. So I now have enforced parameters. Will these two requests in transparent mode be allowed or blocked?
Allowed.
Allowed. Again, nothing gets blocked in blocking mode. How about if I move to blocking mode? Allowed or blocked?
Blocked.
Which one?
Blocked.
Blocked, thank you. Now, these illegal requests will be blocked. One, I'm glad was blocked because it was a true attempt to do cross-site scripting. The other one, I might not be so glad it was blocked because this wasn't a malicious request. The user will get a blocking page and we have a false positive. And that's because by the time this comment field was enforced, nobody had ever entered a comment with an exclamation mark in the months and months that this might have been in staging. That's kind of unlikely, but it's always a possibility. This slide, to me, is probably the key summarization of this whole subject. Why the concept of staging and enforcement is so important. Because it is very possible that you're going to have a policy with file types, URLs, and parameters where some are enforced and some are still in staging. And you might have your IT department calling saying, I don't understand. We keep getting hit with SQL injection attacks on the first name parameter. I thought you said we had a security policy in place. I come here and I look, well, why? Oh, my first name parameter is not enforced. I have heard many stories of, even from SEs, from their fault, where their security policy was done. All the parameters, all the attributes were created for the parameters, file types, we're in blocking mode, nothing was taken out of staging. Everything was still in staging. So every one of these malicious requests to violate the maximum length, the meta characters, attack signatures, so all cross-site scripting, all SQL injection, all allowed, because they all fell into this field right here. They did not understand that they needed those items needed to be enforced. That's the key thing. Now, entities are not the only items in a security policy that has staging and enforcement. The other is attack signatures. By default, all attack signatures are in staging. The general reasoning for this is most customers like to identify false positives before they actually block somebody. So they can use staging and the event log to identify illegal requests that didn't get blocked, but they triggered a signature violation, and they can slowly start enforcing signatures when they need to. That's one way to do it. In the next ASM class I'm putting together, I told you there's a full attack signatures lesson. And in that lesson, one of the things they'll do is they'll trigger 10 or 15 signature violations, and then they can go view those exact violations and enforce just those signatures just like that. So that could be a process they go through. Or there could be one other thing they could do. They're just like, you know what? I just want to have all signatures enforced. I want to enforce everything at one time. But this is an important thing to know. Read that. Non-enforced signatures don't block requests. They're still in staging. I had an SE a couple years ago come to boot camp, and he told me the story that he had a customer he had taken over in Japan. They had had ASM in place for over a year. Unfortunately, it had been put together, helped by his previous SE predecessor that he replaced. And for a year, they still were continuing to get hit by tons of attacks. He realized that you can come to the learning blocking settings page, you can open your attack signatures, and with this one checkbox, save it, apply it, problem solved. That customer now is blocking all of those attacks. That's all they needed to do, and it was never done. So you've now made it through what I think is the most challenging lesson of this entire day. Maybe today and tomorrow. So in review of your 2-day partner boot camp, those that were in my room, on a couple of screens at the end, it calls out staging. It says, oh look, notice that these are still in staging. Your attack signatures are still in staging. And my advice was, bring that up, but don't start diving into it. Don't start trying to explain it. Use that as a way to get them to take this class. Say, if you would like to learn more about staging, come take the 2-day security class. You will learn everything about staging. But we certainly don't have time in that 3-day partner boot camp to talk about all of this. Same thing about learning scores. If they start asking you, well, what does that learning score mean? And how does the learning score go up? And so forth. Well, now you have enough, you could start understanding it. You probably could explain it. But if you started trying to explain it too much, you could need half an hour to go into it. Instead, encourage them to come take this class. They can learn it all. So before we break for the exercise, now's your opportunity to clarify anything we covered in here. If you feel like, I think I kind of got that, that's huge. That's very good. The exercise also helps. to identify what we just covered as well. So maybe let's do this. What time is it? Let's start the exercise. I think what we can do, if you guys are okay with it, I'd rather have you do the exercise now while it's still fresh in your head, and then we'll go to lunch when we're done. And as you're finishing, maybe we can just start going down to lunch and we'll join each other. But let's review, let's kind of go over what you're going to do in this exercise. You don't have to go into this detail with your students if you don't want to, but I want to explain a couple things to you guys. So you're going to start with a brand new security policy. You're deleting the old ones, you're starting with a brand new one, building a new security policy using automatic builder, trusted requests, adding file type learning, URL, parameters, so forth and so on. And then you're going to run the macro, generate some requests. On task 2, you're going to adjust several of the learning score values, the values that will drastically lower. Remember I told you earlier, 0.0001 day is about around 9 seconds. So what you're basically saying is, I want ASM to take into account requests from the same source every 9 seconds, which typically you would never do. So the trick to this exercise, once you've adjusted the learning scores, and then you're going to what we call stabilize the policy. Stabilizing the policy means trying to get as many file types, parameters, URLs enforced. The more of those we have enforced, the more stable the policy is. And the key to this exercise is for you to see the automatic policy builder automatically enforcing those things for you. That we're not going to do it manually. So you should see your file types becoming enforced. You should see your parameters becoming enforced. You should see the attributes changing. Maximum length for a file type, maximum length for a parameter, and meta characters, and so forth and so on. And then you're going to do that. You're going to run the macro a few times, The key thing in this exercise, I've called it out as an important note on page 15. If the students don't read this note and they don't follow this note and they move on before the conditions of this note are not met, then the rest of the exercise isn't going to exactly go as expected. Because here's what happens prior to this note. They will get a parameter. It's called the name parameter. That's the name of the parameter. Name. They'll get a parameter to a point where it's enforced. All the attributes are set. But then you open up a new web browser and you submit some new requests that change the picture. And what you'll see is the name parameter comes back into staging. Because there's new requests and we're still in a learning process, learning hasn't been disabled, it'll actually take this out of enforcement and put it back into staging. And it'll add some new attributes because of the requests you made. And then you'll make the requests again. And eventually, this will become enforced again. It'll go out of staging again. It'll become enforced. They should not move on from this until it is out of staging again. It's enforced again. If they move on from this and it's still in staging, the rest of the steps won't work as expected. That's really the key thing. It all comes together in the last task, where you will then violate requests and see if they're allowed or blocked and why they're allowed or blocked, trying to determine that. So, a fun exercise, I think. It sometimes is an exercise that might even take you a couple of times to go through it to really catch everything that's happening. So let's go ahead and get on to that.